When criticizing American democracy, it's easy for the usual talking points to revolve around voter disenfranchisement or even the lack of active voters in this country. However, this whole argument about whether America is a democracy or not really boils down to the results, not the causes. It's important to look at these ills through a consequentialist lens, since the litmus test for a democratic system should have its basis in outcomes reflecting the public will. This forms a more solid argument, as incongruent outcomes show more empirically whether or not a democracy is failing in its goals, rather than hoping to make the same connection through critiquing the many separate failings within a system. In short, the purpose of a democracy is, through the consent of the governed, to enact what the majority of the governed wills. Put simply, a bill gets passed in a democracy because a majority of the people view it favorably and vote accordingly. Obviously, this is not the outcome of American democracy, and my argument here is going to revolve around this one graph. Based on decades worth of data, this graph from a Princeton study shows that no matter the public support for a bill, it has the same likelihood of being passed. About 30%. This outcome shows right away that America is not a democracy, as its outcomes do not reflect what would be true or optimal in a democratic system. The public's opinion does not reflect on the laws being passed. Many, usually of right-wing politics, like to argue that America isn't really a democracy, but instead a republic, and I'm going to shut down that idea as well. The second part to the graph that I showed earlier is a line that represents the interests of the top 10% in this country, the people who can afford to buy lobbyists and the like. If they have zero support for a bill, instead of it having a 30% chance of passing, like it is across the spectrum for regular Americans, it has a near 0% chance. If all the top 10% support a bill, it has a 61% likelihood of passing, over double that of regular Americans at the same favorability. There actually is a name for this exact system. It's not democracy, and it's not republic either. It's a plutocracy. Plutocracies are defined by a society or country ruled by the wealthy, and the graph I'm showing here clearly proves this. Its outcomes are congruent with what would be the results of a plutocratic system. This isn't to say that we shouldn't care about the things that keep voters from being heard and the problems that essentially erode our democracy, but we must understand that to name a system, we have to look at who controls it and what the outcomes are. When proving America is not a democracy, it is in poor taste to argue about polling stations closing or mass voter deregistration. These are causes, but they are not outcomes. When we eventually get to fixing these issues, or go above and beyond and implement things like ranked choice voting, our way of proving if it moves us further away from plutocracy will be if the lines in this graph I show change. Obviously, the biggest ways to change those outcomes would be to get money out of politics, make voting immensely more accessible to people of all demographics, along with getting rid of the immense buffers that obfuscate or nullify voter power, such as the Electoral College or the Supreme Court. I don't consider the full realization of these goals entirely realistic under the current system of global neoliberal capitalism, as reaching said goals basically undermines their entire oppressive system. One could certainly come to the conclusion, based on this argument and historical precedent, that capitalism is incompatible with democracy because capitalists are always the minority, and for their practices to function, they require a monopoly on political power, which is much easier to achieve in anti-democratic systems, such as fascism and plutocracy, than it is in economically populist systems, such as socialism or communism. The important part about this whole analysis of American democracy is that those who are trying to manufacture your consent are trying to get you trapped in a system of their doing. They don't favor democracy, so they structure a plutocracy and convince you that the system you're participating in is otherwise still legitimate and controlled by the will of the people. They prefer a system in which their say is not equal to that of any other person in their country, but instead worth immensely more through moneyed interests. A capitalist is terrified of the thought of you having the same governmental power as them, which is what a democracy would entail. What is less dangerous to those who wish to keep the plutocratic status quo is a person who thinks voting is their primary and only mode of political action. While voting is useful for harm reduction and buying revolutionaries time, it is not the actual mode in which we will change the system. Remember, you cannot overthrow a system by the methods of which the people in control provide you. A ruler will not give you the sword to stab him with. Instead, when people practice forms of change that more directly and immensely improve the lives of their fellow countrymen, it is fought against in some way by the plutocrats who wish for you to only practice your politics in their system. Supplies for the needy are destroyed by police, unions are busted, and co-ops are unfairly outcompeted by monopolies, protests are met with inequivalent violence from the state, and of course, politicians who support any of these revolutionary actions are shut down and branded as extremist, dangerous radicals. Which, I guess if dangerous means being bad for the current system, then you could almost consider that a compliment. Regardless, the system we are currently participating in is both not democratic in its outcomes or methods, but also serves as a distraction for many people to keep them away from praxis that would be more helpful directly to the individuals in their community. We delay or attempt to minimize problems with voting, and then work on them in person. While we are imprisoned in the system of capitalism, we don't have to let plutocracy be the system that imprisons us politically.